Earlier this year, this congregation celebrated an in-gathering water communion, in which we each added a few drops of water from many different places, combining them into one communal pool, a reminder of how we are all connected. Later, in the spring, we will celebrate a flower communion, and everyone will leave with a single bloom to remind us of life's constant renewal and its unique worth. We Unitarian Universalists call these ceremonies communion, partly because they are literally communal acts of fellowship and exchange, but we also call them communion because that word in particular carries a deep history, with roots in the Christian ritual of shared bread and wine and the power of tradition and repetition. Unitarianism and Universalism began as Protestant Christian denominations, and our celebration of various communions is a reflection of that history. So given that this month's ministry theme is legacy, let's talk about the legacy of communion. In fact, another name for Christian communion, Eucharist, is simply the Greek word for thanksgiving. So if any Sunday were a time to reflect on sharing food around a communal table in celebration of Thanksgiving, today has to be the day. Unitarian Universalism has most certainly grown beyond its Christian roots and expanded into something far more inclusive and theologically diverse. Our congregations include Christians, yes, but also Jews and Buddhists and Muslims and atheists and more, including those whose theologies don't fall easily under just one label. I stand before you as an openly non-theistic minister, something that would have been impossible just a few generations ago. And I stand ready to dedicate my life's work to sustaining this beautiful and unusual faith community in the world. There are some Unitarian Universalist congregations who do celebrate communion in the traditional sense, with consecrated bread and wine, in remembrance of the life and death of Jesus of Nazareth, but it isn't typical among our congregations. We may meet in a church building, we may sit in pews, listen to sermons from ministers wearing black robes, we may sing hymns and say prayers, but for the most part, they lack the words God or Jesus. We've opened up space in these traditionally Christian forms to allow everyone to participate. So something like communion, so completely associated with Christianity, and specifically with Jesus, it feels like a bit too much for us. I mean, it's so Christian. The biblical story of the Last Supper, which led to the practice of communion, shows up a few different places in the Christian New Testament. The story, as Paul tells it in the first letter to the Corinthians, goes like this. The Lord Jesus, on the night when he was betrayed, took a loaf of bread, and when he had given thanks, he broke it and said, "This is my body that is for you. Do this in remembrance of me." In the same way, he took the cup also after supper, saying, "This cup is the new covenant in my blood. Do this as often as you drink it in remembrance of me. For as often as you eat this bread and drink the cup, you proclaim the Lord's death until he come again." The story Paul tells here is a story about a man known to speak in metaphor and riddles, a man about to be condemned to death, who asks his friends to remember him and to continue on the path they had walked together even after he is gone. It's a story told in the context of a brand new faith community, barely holding on in small enclaves scattered through the Roman Empire, a story looking for the unifying threads of belief and practice that might tie all these communities together. So there's something powerful about knowing that this Lord's Supper became a practice carried forward to this very day by followers of the religion that grew out of those stories. I've been a visitor to many different churches where communion was being taken, but as an atheist, I never felt comfortable or appropriate participating. Only once did I ever walk forward and take part, and it was because I was invited. In a non-denominational Christian church I once visited, the minister held the bread and wine and said with a welcoming smile, "It does not matter where you are in your relationship to the church or to God. It does not matter how much you doubt or if you believe. This is still for you." I felt explicitly welcomed, so I walked forward and accepted the blessing of that minister. And when I returned to my seat and swallowed the tiny mouthful of bread and wine I'd received, I actually teared up a little bit with emotion. To be included was powerful, and thinking about the continuity of this ritual over thousands of years, the millions of others who also took bread and wine and thought about what it means to remember someone and what it means to be in the presence of something holy. The powerful weight of that legacy just hit me all at once, and it brought tears to my eyes. The experience remains an important and emotional memory to me, and it's with incredible gratitude that I remember that minister's explicit welcome, regardless of my theological status. Without the invitation and its message of acceptance, I would never have been able to access that powerful and spiritually moving moment. This was a communion enacted as a true welcome table, an all-embracing ritual of feeding the world regardless of the borders we put up between ourselves. It is appealing to think of communion as a unifying constant, a ritual and sacrament that ties all Christian faith communities together across time and space and even across heretical difference. But in actuality, communion has just as often been a point of difference and conflict and discontinuity in the history of the Christian world. In fact, each part of what we now think of as communion has at some point been the subject of intense controversy and dramatic change over the course of the last 2,000 years. It wasn't until the year 1215 that the word transubstantiation was made an official part of the theology of communion, a word affirming the belief that bread and wine literally becomes the body and blood of Christ, and then stirring up a never-ending debate over how exactly to describe the mystery of God's presence in the practice. Along comes the Protestant Reformation, and each new denomination needs to define exactly what's happening as they follow the command to take and eat. They needed to think through just who was welcome at the Lord's table. The Anglican Church changed transubstantiation into the real presence of Christ in the sacrament, and actually made it illegal for public officials in England to believe in transubstantiation. Because the idea that Christ's flesh and blood was literally being consumed was considered to be barbaric. And yet their preferred phrase of real presence was left deliberately partly undefined to still allow for some mystery. Eventually, there were further reformers who felt that the Lord's Supper should not be mysterious at all, should only be observed as a memorial meal, eaten in remembrance of Jesus the man, and not as a way to commune with his literal presence. What I'm trying to say is that the idea that there's some singular, unified practice called communion is not quite accurate and never has been. I know that many of you here today have had your own experiences with Christian communion, for good or ill. You no doubt have your own stories of how it can be sometimes a meaningful bond to something greater, sometimes a tool for excluding so-called sinners and those who are different, and sometimes just an opaque and confusing ritual you were never truly welcomed into. Your experiences are also a part of this story. When we consider today how we as Unitarian Universalists feel about the idea of communion and what type of communions we're going to practice, we need to keep in mind all the vast diversity of what it can mean. Is it a unifying practice or is it divisive? The truth is, it's both. Is it simple bread and wine or an unknowable mystery? Across history, it has been both. You may be interested to know that our Unitarian and Universalist forebears also dealt with conflict and controversy over communion. Ralph Waldo Emerson, Unitarian minister and prominent transcendentalist, actually left the ministry over this issue. The last sermon he preached as minister to his Boston congregation in 1832 was titled The Lord's Supper, and it laid out his many objections to the practice. Surprisingly, he didn't find the Lord's Supper to be too Christian, but to be too Jewish. Emerson, allowing the anti-Jewish sentiment of his time to influence his thinking, argued that breaking bread and sharing wine is a holdover from the, quote, primitive local customs of Jesus' time, a ritual for ritual's sake. Emerson analyzes the passage where Jesus says, "Do this in remembrance of me," and he declares, quote, "I cannot bring myself to believe that in the use of this expression, he looked beyond the living generation and meant to impose a memorial feast upon the whole world." Emerson preached this sermon to his congregation and announced that he would no longer be able to provide them with consecrated communion. They asked him to leave and called a different minister. And as for Universalists, influential 18th century Universalist thinker Judith Sargent Murray wrote a catechism to educate young children in theology and voiced her objection to communion in fewer words and with less bigotry than Emerson did. She said the tradition of taking communion, quote, "seems entirely a mode of human invention, of which no trace is to be found in sacred writ." When asked how a good Christian ought to react to being offered communion, she responded, "Wherever he beholds bread and wine, he will receive it with thankful gratitude, and he will adore the grace contained therein." In other words, bread and wine is blessing enough. No need to treat it as a mystery when it's already a miraculous gift. I love that. Our current relationship or non-relationship to communion is thanks in part to these early rejectors, these Unitarians and Universalist believers who saw the Lord's Supper being used mostly to maintain old systems of authority and thought the solution was to discard it entirely. But it's worth noting that even after his argument against the practice, the congregation Emerson served still would not stop taking communion. Even if they understood the biblical interpretation and appreciated his textual analysis, they still felt that the ritual held meaning for them. So much that they would rather give up a powerful preacher and leader and thinker like Emerson than give up the continuity of that tradition. Emerson and Sargent Murray had the idea that a ritual that is human-invented rather than scripturally ordained should therefore not be observed. And I'm afraid I disagree with them. Human-invented rituals are themselves powerful because humans make them powerful. Think about the memories of the family bread traditions that we invoked this morning. Are those practices passed down through generations less valuable because they are merely human in origin? I don't think so. What if the solution to all the complicated history of coercion and exclusion isn't to discard the legacy of the so-called Lord's Supper, but to rediscover it, to expand it, to make it wider still until it includes all who would like to experience the welcome table, all who would like to take and eat in remembrance of ancient roots and a long-ago struggle. Listed among the sources of our eclectic faith are wisdom from the world's religions, Jewish and Christian teachings, words and deeds of prophetic people, and the direct experience of transcendent mystery and wonder. All of this is a part of us. These are traditions that we belong to. We don't all have to embrace every part of our legacy. Please know that the fraught history of communion will not be smoothed over by a Sunday morning word from me. We don't all have to embrace our legacy, but I think we do have to at least know about it. Unitarian Universalism can be an individualistic religion. It's the joy of a non-creedal faith, that we are free to choose for ourselves how to participate and how we believe. We do have a tradition of ordained ministry, but I struggle to come up with even one UU ritual that actually requires an ordained UU minister to perform it. But we do come together time and time again to celebrate the rituals and ceremonies that exist only in the context of a larger faith community. Baby dedications, water ceremonies, festivals of light. It isn't the minister, but the community that consecrates our sacraments, connecting us all to each other and to the greater web of our histories and our futures. We broke bread together today, and it wasn't a communion in the traditional sense, but it was something wonderful and something wonderfully UU. Perhaps it's the beginning of re-familiarizing ourselves with the parts of our heritage that our Unitarian Universalist ancestors pushed to the side. The beginning of claiming space at the welcome table for the people we are today, and making room for all types of relationships to our faith's Christian heritage. Room at the table for those who are Christian, those who have left Christianity behind, or are moving sometimes away and sometimes toward it. Those who, like me, are not Christian and never have been, but who are Unitarian Universalists, and thus still the inheritors of this once Christian legacy. Did you know that First Parish, this church, has a full set of communion silver? I got to see it recently. These beautiful, shining cups and platters, given as gifts from beloved ministers or passed down from families of parishioners. There are dates engraved on them as early as 1815 and as recent as 1936. One small cup and plate are marked specifically to be brought to the housebound who wish to still be a part of the church's shared meal. When I was growing up as a UU in Missouri, I attended church in the basement of an elementary school. I never could have dreamed of such a deeply established history, such tangible evidence of our roots. And where is the silver now? Where are those beautiful pieces of our heritage? Well, they're packed away in an old suitcase locked in a safe, waiting for us to decide what their place might be in the Unitarian Universalist faith of today. I can't pretend to know what that place will be, but I know that our history isn't going anywhere, and I know that neither are we. So let's continue to expand our welcome, get to know our history and ourselves and each other, and keep working to keep this world well-nourished in every way that we can.